You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 339. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me as co-host this week is Nate. Hello, Nate.
Great to be here, Bill.
And joining us is the host of Conspiracy You Can Believe In, Patrick. Hi, Patrick.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Patrick, your show, Conspiracy You Can Believe In, is a pretty interesting historical podcast that looks at actual, pretty much provable, or some cases less provable conspiracies. Usually, if they're less provable, they're something more fantastical, like, was the false Dmitri the actual Dmitri in Russia?
I mentioned that.
It's something that you can make an argument for, credible ones.
Right. But in this case, we're going to be talking about doing a follow-up to your recent episode where you talked about the concept of planned obsolescence, but a specific criminal conspiracy, corporate conspiracy around that, which was the Phoebus Cartel. And this is I think a great example of what your show does, which is to look at something that's kind of obscure. It's not a Looney Tunes conspiracy. In this case, it's something that definitely happened, and we can talk about that in just a second. But it's like a good thing that people wouldn't necessarily otherwise know about. So why don't you briefly explain, and people can listen for the full details on your episode that you already did on your show. But what was the Phoebus Cartel? What was the conspiracy element there?
Yeah, so the Phoebus Cartel was a cartel of light bulb manufacturers in the early 20th century. It started in the 20s. Basically, the most light bulb manufacturers up to that point, they were trying to make light bulbs last as long as possible. They were up to about 2,500 hours of life on average. And of course, there's some light bulbs that exist from that time that have been burning for like 100 years. The Phoebus Cartel was a collection of different manufacturers. There was GE's overseas affiliates, Philips International, and a couple other ones from like Hungary and Germany's Osram company. They got together and they carved up the world into different sectors of manufacture. They set price controls, they set manufacturing controls, all this, the sort of things a cartel does. But one of the first innovations in monopoly, I guess, that they introduced was setting death dates for the product. And it was one of the first times that people had seen like an example of planned obsolescence, which is planning for a product to fail at a certain time so that consumers have to go back and buy another one. Now, some people have said in their defense that there's all sorts of trade-offs in making bulbs last longer. They will use more voltage, but they really did want people to go out and buy more bulbs, and that's why they were setting the life. I think they tried to set it down to 1,000 or 1,500 hours. And they had a testing lab in Switzerland. They would take all of the light bulbs from every different factory that was part of the cartel. They would test them and make sure that they were not cheating and actually making long-lasting light bulbs. And if they did cheat, then they would be fined by the cartel. And this went on until World War II, when the countries where the cartel companies were located started to go to war with each other, and it fell apart. It was kind of unknown for a long time until Gravity's Rainbow came out by Thomas Pynchon, and he had a section in the book that was about a living light bulb called Byron that lasted forever and was being hunted down by this thing called the Phoebus Cartel. In the 90s, a media studies professor named Marcus Krajewski in Basel, Switzerland, started to research it, and he went into the Osram company's records in Berlin and got all this information about the Phoebus Cartel, found out not only was it real, but everything that they did was documented. And it was all written down. So it's one of those that's it definitely happened, and they wrote down everything that they did while they were doing it. And it sounds like, this kooky conspiracy, but it definitely was real.
So one of the things that we've talked about, or I guess it's been a big theme of the show on Arsenal for Democracy for the past year or so, is sort of the industrial development in particularly the late 19th century, early 20th century. This feels like a great example of that, and sort of what the perverse incentives are under the, fully industrialized capitalism. And I think that's what we'll be talking a lot about today, and how some of the other things that you brought up on your episode are good examples of how that functions. One thing that we talked about several weeks ago on the show was about the bicycle industry and like some of the impacts that their research had eventually on the auto industry. But a lot of the idea of planned obsolescence, although as you talked about on your episode, there's various kind of sort of types of obsolescence. But one of the sort of obsolescent forms was coming up with bicycle models of the year. And this is something that you talked about for various other companies and industries. But basically this pressure to come up with sales year after year after year at a rate that outstrips the actual growth of the market means that you have to either make some of your stuff unfashionable the next year or not work the next year. Could you talk a little bit about the distinctions between those different types of obsolescences? You had cited a book in your episode that kind of went over those distinctions.
Yeah, it's the book is called The Waste Makers by Vance Packard. Vance Packard was an investigative journalist in the 50s and 60s, and he's kind of hard to nail down politically today. He was considered a liberal in his time, but he was very much like this. You don't see too much of this now, but kind of like a early 20th century progressive, like this very paternalistic, Puritan type. His ideal society that he mentioned several times in the book is the small New England town where everyone is thrifty and hardworking, and they have a public space in the center of town, and it's not overwhelmed by consumerism. And that's what his big enemy was in the 50s that he was railing about was consumerism. And he felt that planned obsolescence was one of the drivers of waste. And to prove that, he went through all of these different trade publications where marketers and advertisers were openly talking about it. And I guess just as a point of disclosure, I work in advertising myself. I'm a copywriter on my day job. And it's really funny to like watch him talk about things and trends going on in politics and industry in the 50s that we see in the present day. One of the things that he points out is called obsolescence of desirability. And that's something like introducing yearly models in cars. And he really hates that. He's like, there's really no reason to be doing that. You don't need to buy a car every year. And a lot of the things that they were doing in the 50s was just adding more fins or making the cars bigger, which of course increases their gas consumption. And you just have to buy more gas then. And they were getting tax breaks based on the weight of the vehicle. And you notice stuff like this with like trucks are like 7 times as big as they used to be. And there's absolutely no reason to be doing that. And he really railed against government policies that incentivized manufacturers and designers to produce more than they needed. He pointed to compact cars in Europe as something that we should be doing. He even talks about like maglev trains as a form of public transport. Like he gets into this vision of the future that looks a lot like what some urbanists would think of today. But yeah, that's one of the big things that he rails against is obsolescence of desirability. The fact that you have 27 different brands of toothpaste in the grocery store that all do the same thing, but they're just trying to outmarket each other. And there's no reason for you to have that much. That's one of the bigger examples of planned obsolescence in American society, but it's hard to pin down because people aren't necessarily designing things to break. They're just designing things to go out of style.
But also to break in the case of the light bulbs.
Yeah, that's the actual planned obsolescence. That's the obsolescence of design, where they build into the product to actually fall apart. A lot of his research was based on Consumers Union, which is the organization that puts out consumer reports. They had a testing lab in the 1950s that they built, and they did wear tests and use tests on washing machines in particular, were considered a major source of planned obsolescence of design. They would fall apart within a couple years. And televisions were another one where they were just designed essentially to break. And repair technicians were not given the schematics of these devices, so you couldn't easily repair it. They really did want people to go out and buy more stuff in order to save the economy, because they believed that economic growth uh, could only be furthered by people going out and buying more things. In 1958, they hit a severe recession, sometimes called the Eisenhower recession, that was really much of it was driven by the upper middle class of the United States, which that's who people advertise to in this country. They had everything that they needed. They had a home, they had a car, they had a fridge, they had the basic appliances and necessities of life, but they were being advertised to and incentivized to buy more than what they needed. And that's something that Packard really rails against in the book. Basically, this idea of economic growth in the United States can only continue, can only, quote, progress if people waste more. So they go out and buy stuff that they don't actually need.
And it kind of became baked into the political ideology as well, not just with Eisenhower himself telling people to go out and buy stuff, but this idea that, it was a Cold War battle, that, the communists don't let you buy more than what you need, and they don't let you buy all the different designs and have all the different options to choose from at the store, and that's bad because we're freer because we have those options. You mentioned, though, just now about the idea that it wasn't just a question of something breaking down and then, people having to go buy stuff, because people also sometimes wanted to repair things. And of course, that's kind of the mythology that people remember, the 1950s, fixing up an old car or something like that. And one of the other things that you talk about in your episode is this idea that it has gotten harder and harder to repair things, not just because they're made out of worse materials that can't be repaired, but also because the companies are actively working on deterring that. And that's something we wanted to talk about today when we had you on.
Yeah, the right to repair movement is something that is encompassing a lot of different industries. Of course, you in Massachusetts just had another referendum affirming the right to repair movement this past November with the automotive industry. But it also covers stuff like electronics, farm equipment, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and almost everything in your house that connects to the internet. Because a really easy way to brick a physical object is to introduce a software update that makes it no longer usable. There's of course a lot of obsolescence of desirability, where you make it so it's no longer fashionable to have like an iPhone 6S or a flip phone or whatever. So you have to go out and buy another one. But there's also obsolescence of design, where maybe you don't make it available to repair those older models anymore. So you have to go out and buy a new one.
Right. I've got one of the laptops that I'm recording this on. I can basically only use for recording this, but I can't even use a newer one for recording it because it doesn't have the right ports. I can't upgrade that computer because, yes, some of it is that the design has been genuinely outstripped. It's too slow to run certain things, but a lot of it is like, well, sorry, we don't support the software update for that anymore.
Right. And sometimes it's getting, shorter and shorter with a lot of electronic devices of how long you can keep a piece of equipment. I had a PC that got bricked by a Windows update just last year, and I'd only had it for a few years, but it was completely impossible to be able to repair it, so I had to go buy a new one. This kind of stuff is in almost every industry. I know a large part of my episode was devoted to farm equipment because there is such an active movement to stop the major manufacturers from making it difficult to repair tractors and other farm equipment. John Deere is probably one of the biggest culprits with planned obsolescence in their farm equipment.
Well, I definitely want to talk more about that, but I'll go to Nate now to talk a little bit about the two different ballot questions in Massachusetts, both of which passed, one in 2012 and one in 2020. This is something that you alluded to on your episode, but we wanted to get into it in a little bit more depth here since Nate and I are both in Massachusetts. So, Nate, what do we need to know about these two ballot questions that passed?
So just quickly wanted to mention some of Patrick's tweets from the podcast account here, basically talking about how what is your uncle and grandfather were both auto workers in Lansing, so they were able to actually repair the tractors pretty
Yeah,
competently.
my mom grew up on a farm in Michigan, and her family were auto workers as well in auto working season. And my uncle Kenny has a real genius for building and repairing farm equipment. The way that John Deere is setting up a lot of their user agreements is that you can be sued for violating the terms of service because there's so much software in modern tractors. Yeah, this is activity that farmers have been engaged in for generations all across the country, building and repairing their own stuff. And it just blows my mind that that should be made illegal or that they could be faced lawsuits over doing it.
Yeah, and you said that it's really this sort of policy is really harmful to family farms, whereas the large agribusiness corporations can probably get people to handle the software update or whatever, So, but I guess, yeah, we should talk about the right to repair laws here in Massachusetts. I remember when this was announced as a ballot question, I was sort of scratching my head, like, what does this mean? Like, what is the implication of it? I don't think I really quite understood what the stakes were up until even recently, maybe until after I voted, because I voted yes on it. I remember, Bill, you said you did as well. But I didn't quite understand what the stakes were. And it was sort of interesting because you would see all these signs supporting it outside of the small service stations, like Independent Place where you can get like your car stickered or whatever. But the big sort of a car manufacturing selling places, the car lots, they all had no on one stickers. And Bill, you mentioned that you saw a couple ads that hit the airwaves pretty late in the election cycle.
I don't think I saw them personally, but people were telling me, especially because, as you said, a lot of people were kind of confused as to what the referendum was even about. Mostly, I think the ads backfired, but it was these major, car manufacturer companies and so forth in the 2020 referendum, which was focused on automotive, saying that, like, if you let anybody other than the dealer make updates to the software or repair your car, which usually at this point requires some computer work, given the current state of the technology, then, if they have to turn over that data to these independent repair shops like you were talking about, that was going to like leave you vulnerable to data risks and therefore sexual assault, which was kind of a crazy over the top, like slippery slope argument to make. I'm sure that the idea that no major manufacturer of cars has had a data breach would be laughable. And the idea that somehow this independent repair guy is more menacing than your average guy at the car dealer, I think is also a little bit silly. But like that, that was basically the only challenge they really put up to this. I think they were maybe taken by surprise as well on this. But it was this over the top ad campaign was their central focus of saying that, people were going to get sexually assaulted if independent auto repair shops were able to do work on these, cars. And I think, you might talk about this as well, Nate, but that one of the key provisions of this was saying that they had to allow like independent technicians to access the software and work on it, and that they had to like turn over manuals on how to do that. Because right now, we are long past the days of the high school shop class where people learn how to fix cars because it requires computer science work at this point.
Yeah, so I guess as a result of question 1 being adopted, manufacturers have until 2021 or 2022 of car model years to install the open data platform, or I think it was called OEM in other places. But that would basically, via smartphone app, I guess, have access to certain data, telematics, and things like that, that would basically enable people to fix it. So they were saying, one of the industry groups, iFixit, they're saying Tuesday's victory shows people overwhelming support fair repair, and they want people to trust to fix the things they own. So, it kind of seems like there wasn't a ton of resistance, as you mentioned, Bill, just sort of throwing some stuff against the wall. And I think in general, if you just read the ballot question, it's like, sure, I guess I'll let independent car dealers or whatever be able to act, because usually you're not taking your car for repair at the actual dealership,
A lot of people do though, but yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like the more complicated it gets and so forth, the more likely you are to just say, "Oh, I'll just take it to the folks that made the car that know how it works or whatever." But that's usually often more expensive. It maybe is less convenient, etc. But as you say, a lot of this really comes down to this idea that and I think this is going to be a central theme of the rest of what we talk about on this episode, is this idea that people instinctively say, well, you should be able to repair a thing that you own, whether it's yourself or an independent person. If you own it, you should be able to repair it. And Patrick, one of the things that you explored in your episode is that increasingly one of the defensive tactics that the industry is putting up to stop that is saying, oh, actually, you don't own the thing that you thought you owned.
Yeah, in the instance of farm equipment, it's very similar to what Nate was talking about, where John Deere, for instance, only wants farmers to repair things that involve the software, which is almost anything on the vehicle these days, at licensed dealers. And the problem with farmers is, by nature, they're rural. The dealer could be 60 miles away. And so people naturally want to repair things that they believe that they own. The issue with John Deere is that in 2015, they submitted a comment to the U.S. Copyright Office that argued the farmers that buy a piece of farm equipment, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of dollars, do not actually own it, that they are merely leasing the use of the vehicle because of the proprietary software. Now, right now, I believe that it is not fully settled in court. Farmers are basically given a stay on legally being prosecuted for breaking the proprietary software, but John Deere made every customer sign a user agreement that could open them up to civil penalties if they hack their tractor, basically, to bypass certain things that would make it difficult for them to fix the tractor on their own. So it really brings in this question of ownership, and they're using the Digital Millennium Copyright Act as part of their argument, that because of this proprietary software, they control the use of the vehicle. And with farm equipment, the computer control of the vehicle is much more extensive than even your modern automobile. It controls and stores data about the farm. Some things that could be considered trade secrets of the farmers would be stored in John Deere's servers. They could even be controlled by remote by John Deere. They could be shut down at once if there is some kind of data breach. So we're really trusting this private company with a lot of things that should be probably the purview of the federal government. Data security, national security, because this affects the food chain, also safety and emissions. These aren't things that John Deere should control, but they're making the argument that they should.
There's another leftist podcast based in Britain called Trash Future, which has a running joke on their show that everything in the current U.S. or global capitalist economy is basically what the capitalists used to denounce Soviet communism for, which is that no one owns anything and the central planners are committed to arbitrary quotas of tractor production. In this case, that seems literally the case. And
that is literally what's going on. Yeah.
And you see, John Deere is trying to juice their tractor production sales, but they're also trying to prevent anyone from actually owning the tractors. They're just licensing it to them and saying, you're just leasing the software. It's just like, if you buy a license to Microsoft Office or something like that. And, that we're going to, because they've had this falling sales in terms of the actual tractors, then they're going to make their money off the service calls instead.
Yeah. Basically, they're kind of arguing that you're not really buying a tractor, you're just buying a piece of software that you can attach a plow to. It is really, they're trying to move to a licensing-based model because they're an increasingly large part of their business is through repairs and parts, not the actual selling of the tractors themselves.
I was just going to say this whole thing involving suing the farmers sort of reminds me of things going on with Monsanto suing farmers for if their seeds were used in an unauthorized fashion or something like that.
Or cross-pollinated.
Yeah, cross-pollinated. So that sort of seems like it's a similar trend where these large corporations are basically suing farmers who are just sort of doing the normal farming thing, which is repairing your own equipment and getting new seeds in from other sources. So, I mean, that sort of ties these things together here.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not, it's not really a bunch of leftist people that are the driving force behind this.
Right.
Because we're talking about farm country. There's Republicans and Democrats as well throughout there, but it is kind of a common sense idea that you think if you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a piece of equipment, you do own it, and you want to extend its life for as long as possible. One of the Vice articles about this, about farmers hacking their tractors to be able to make full use of them. This one farmer brought up that, what if they introduce a software update for this tractor I bought 10 years ago, and they stop servicing this tractor that I bought a decade ago? Am I just supposed to throw this thing away? And it's a pretty good point. These are things that are supposed to last generations. They are very complex, expensive pieces of equipment. And it seems like the company is trying to set a lifespan on them, which is very worrying considering, how much energy and resources are put into manufacturing them and how little energy and resources that we currently have. I think the lessons that Vance Packard talked about, as much of a little bit of a crank that he was, they're far more prescient today because of climate change. The clock is really ticking. We can't afford to do stuff like this.
So let's talk a little bit more about that angle. As you said, Packard's book is called The Waste Makers, and he was looking at this from the perspective of the 1950s particularly, and sort of the rise of that culture of waste in and everything. But again, I feel like a lot of this ties into this similar notion as well that, you don't own anything anymore. It's all just temporarily licensed. You're all just, making these monthly payments on something that you have almost no control over. And one of the other things that you talked about, which you've already alluded to on this, is Apple products, for example. Just, they're by no means exclusive in this activity, right? It's lots and lots of manufacturers. But, something like an iPhone, they're simultaneously coming out with lots and lots of new models to make the old ones seem unfashionable, but they also make the old ones not work anymore. They're constantly changing, often with negative reactions from people. What, ports are even available on things, or what features are included in the physical hardware and so forth. But one thing that we've seen, which, this is something that this idea, again, of not owning anything is increasingly hegemonic, but certainly has its origins in a much older period of American history and the American economy. And Packard talks about this in his book, is this idea that, in order to increase sales, because, again, one of the themes that, we've been talking about here over and over again is that eventually you've saturated the market. You got to come up with additional sales somehow, and there's various strategies, nefarious or otherwise, for juicing those sales. But one of the things that a lot of American consumer goods companies made, they decided that in order to increase sales, they were going to make it easier for people to buy stuff and do that through financing. And obviously, some decades ago, people would be familiar with something like, there's normally just buying stuff on credit at your general store or whatever, but a lot of it was like on layaway, right? Like you would pay in installments and they would reserve the item for you and then you would get it at the end. But eventually the paradigm flipped where now you get the item up front and you make your monthly payments, but you don't really ever own the thing, even if it's a phone that is going to be useless and have to be replaced at the end of that time that you financed it. You never really own the thing. It's just making those monthly payments to either license something or rent something or lease it or whatever. And then at the end of that, they say, all right, well, congratulations, you own this phone that you can no longer use. We've got a new model for you to do the same process over again. And of course, from their perspective, they make up the gap in revenues by bundling all of those together and selling them on to some third-party company that has the cash up front to pay for it, right? If you say, well, we're going to get $5 extra a month by financing these phones. We'll sell that, bundle that with 1 million people's contract, sell that onto a third party. We've now got the cash up front that we wouldn't have had otherwise because we gave them the phone before they had paid it off. And that third party company is going to just let those payments come rolling in each month. And it's going to, pay off the principal itself, but it's also going to make those interest payments. And that's now a revenue stream. That is something that I feel like is, a more recent trend to become completely dominant, and I think that's kind of where the entire world economy is heading. Is these bundled monthly payments on never really owning something. But I feel like all of this kind of ties together with those themes. But you commented to me that something you didn't talk about in your episode was that Packard does allude to this sort of in its nascent form in the 1950s in his book, where these companies started trying to figure out, all right, if we can't just force people to buy new stuff by making it not last long enough, if we can't get enough sales by, making a new fashionable brand every year, what else are we going to do? Let's extend credit options to people and financing options.
Yeah, he has a chapter or two about, I guess the birth of the credit industry and credit as a commodity itself, consumer credit and consumer debt. One of the things that he was really against was retailers setting up a bank, basically, in their own stores to give people a credit card or a line of credit to use within the store and to make payments, monthly payments on things that maybe they didn't actually need, but they could upsell them on the newest model of refrigerator or cake mixer or something, and they would be paying for it for months and months when it would be cheaper just to make the more prudent choice of what you want and what you need and pay for it up front. And he interviews a lot of business people and a lot of industry insiders who will, candidly tell him this is a really worrying practice, but it's the only way we can make money. In the late 50s, that's where you really started to see arguments coming from the government and industry leaders that it's patriotic to buy because they needed people to continue to buy to get out of the recession. And privately, they were telling each other, this is a house of cards because everyone in America is now going into debt and they only have these nice things because they have a line of credit. And if something bad happens, boy, we'll all be screwed. I thought it was a pretty interesting argument. In some cases, you kind of see where Vance Packard has a more socially conservative side because he argues against chaotic pricing in supermarkets as well. Everything doesn't really have a single sticker price. You have to buy one, get one to get the actual price, and that's a tactic we continue to see today. Packard doesn't like it because he thinks it confuses housewives. He's not really the most woke when it comes to gender politics. You get that when you read the book. But he does have one argument that I think is very interesting at the end of the book where he talks about the credit industry and what it's done to the American psyche. He has a chapter where he talks about taxes and the immature way that Americans view taxes is something is something that we see today. They don't view any benefit from taxes. They just see it as another thing that they have to pay for. And then they complain that their roads are terrible, their schools suck, they don't have any public parks. And, he rightfully blames the government a little bit for not providing these things. But you need to have taxes. And finally, he's like, why is it that people view taxes this way? And he interviews this woman who says, well, everyone is in debt. They're all, strung out on lines of credit at all these different retail shops. They can't afford anything more because they have been advertised to buy all this stuff that they don't need. And now they can't afford to pay any more in taxes. So he argues for a frugal life in almost this de-registe view of society where you need to have some central planning instead of redirecting it to let's just buy all this crap we don't need and manufacture stuff we don't need. He argues for having a central program of stuff that the United States needs to do in order to survive and thrive. He wants to double education spending, build more schools. He argues for huge infrastructure projects at the level of the New Deal and beyond, and to view consumer spending as just as much waste as taxes on your budget. That these are one and the same, and he doesn't understand why consumers put a wall between them. But he does assign blame to the credit industry for that, for pretty much putting almost every middle-class American household on having no savings whatsoever, because they've been incentivized not to have it.
Right. I mean, it becomes, and this is like the central force today, but you can see it emerging then, that the idea that it's a lifestyle thing. That's how they market it to you. They say, oh,
Yes.
You're not going into crippling debt or whatever that you're never going to be able to fully pay off. You're actually able to, by dividing this up into monthly payments that are based on your income, we can get you that kitchen that you've wanted that has everything, or we can get you that new car. I mean, the joke now is that the U.S. auto manufacturing industry, all of those companies are lending institutions that happen to make cars, because a lot of their business is based on the auto loan financing. But one thing that Packard obviously wouldn't have probably seen coming is the extent to which the economy has been financialized, where the financial instruments, as I alluded to with like bundling, phone financing sales together, that becomes a thing itself that you can sell back and forth between companies, a thing that you can put on your balance sheet as a corporation to say, look, we have income coming in. Obviously, people are sort of familiar with it with the housing market, because of that was a case where the bubble actually burst all at once and, created all these problems. But you can look fairly credibly and say, well, okay, like people are probably still going to be able to make those little $5 a month or however much, extra beyond what they would have been paying payments a month on their phone. Even if times are tight and things get really dire, they're probably still going to be able to make those payments without defaulting, because if you're paying off little things here and there in little monthly payments, you're less likely to, completely default on everything. So you multiply that out by 1 million customers or 10 million customers, and you've got a pretty stable package that you can resell to another company. That's the financialization component of it that's happening. Yes, it emerges in the 1950s especially, and there's obviously precursors as well earlier in the Second Industrial Revolution, but a lot of this sort of consumer debt stuff now is the economy, rather than being this like just, oh, this is a house of cards. It's like, no, this is the house that we all live in now.
Bill, I will say some of the critiques in Packard's book sort of remind me of stuff I was reading in Looking Backwards for the last time I was on, and just sort of this similar critiques coming from the late 19th century about how a lot of economic activity is simply just consumer competition and various manufacturers trying to get the best of one particular industry and then destroy the rest of the producers in that industry, and sort of how the whole system was not really producing things that people actually needed. So I guess that's 60 or so years before, but I guess it seems like there are some similar thoughts in those.
Yeah, the goal here is to make sales rather than to get things to people that need things. And that goes to that point that you talk about at the end of your episode, Patrick, which is that with the climate crisis the way that it is, and just environmental crises in general with, relating to pollution and so forth, that forcing or ideologically compelling or using the coercion of credit to get people to buy things that they don't need, and more of them, and duplicates and replacements and things like that. This all adds up to this tremendous waste problem. And it is, I think, all three of us are leftists. It's incompatible with capitalism to do anything else, right? Like they have to. The engine of capitalism says that it's an imperative that they continue to make sales somehow, some way, no matter the cost, because that's what growth is, that's what productivity is, that's what success looks like, as opposed to if you were to envision some sort of a, leftist economy where the central objective is to get everything, the things that they need, but not more than the things that they need, make sure those things actually last, are quality materials, that sort of thing, and aren't just piling up, the garbage patch in the Pacific, essentially.
Yeah, and Packard, he wasn't a socialist, he wasn't a Marxist, but he was a liberal for his time. And he definitely, I think, mistakenly believes that you can do this in an honest way. If people were just honest and if consumers were prudent, we could fix the problem. But he does have a couple remedies at the end of the book that I think are really interesting, where it's more on the level of like not central planning, but a New Deal type program to redirect creative energies of industry to problems that we need to solve. And one of his examples was, hey, let's get desalination of water really, really good. We don't know how to do it well, and we still don't know how to do it well and cheaply, but he figured if we could redirect all the energy we put in planned obsolescence, reassign those designers into a project like desalination of water, we could solve any kind of water crisis that might come up in the future. And of course, he didn't know about climate change in 1960, but he did foresee problems, ecological problems that would come from waste and pollution because of things like planned obsolescence. So I thought that was an interesting way to look at it from the perspective of a liberal in the 1960s. Was to find and redirect energy to solving problems. He also argued for an American standards association to enforce quality grades of products like furniture and other durable goods. Such a thing exists in places like Britain and a lot of European countries. He essentially makes the argument for the U.S. to become like a social democratic country like in Western Europe. Although he was not himself a socialist, that's basically the ideal that he's looking for. So he's almost there. I think he's a little too trusting of business people, as much as he does criticize them, though.
Well, so much more that we could talk about today, but I think for time reasons, we're going to have to leave it there. As usual, we will put up a post at arsenalfordemocracy.com that has some of the links about what we talked to. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this with us this week.
Thank you. Fan of the show. I'm glad I could be here. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nate.
And again, Patrick's show is Conspiracy You Can Believe In. You can find that pretty much anywhere and give that a listen. There's a lot of stuff. I've recommended all kinds of episodes to people because I think there's a lot of things that, even if you think you know the story, maybe there's something you'll learn from it. Nate, thank you as well for joining me on this bonus episode this week.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Patrick.